So, Nicholas Rees, James Morrow, that's the intro. Let's get to it. Daniel Andrews decides to cancel the Commonwealth Games. James, what a wonderful example of leadership.
What a wonderful example of leadership, Paul, and what a wonderful sort of moment for all the Dan stands out there, like, Nick and everybody else, to say, oh, but, Daddy Dan said it's the right thing to do.
Now Daddy Dan
wants to save money, even though he promised this, of course, so he could get votes in the regions, before the election. Nobody wanted this thing. He said, we'll do this regional strategy. But, people have gone back, Paul, and looked at how much it costs to host a Commonwealth Games. How it manages to get to $7 billion. I mean, these will be some very expensive smoking ceremonies that they're paying for. That's all I've got to say.
Because, of course, Nicholas, the whole reason it became so expensive was because they were going to build temporary stadia that'll all sort of go within a couple of weeks. Reality was, a couple of $1 billion, but you'd have infrastructure left after it. But fair dinkum, I mean, Dan today, even as a hardcore Labor man, as an I stand with Dan, as a man who's got the North Face jacket, there for all winters. Surely even you today go, what?
Well, look, it won't surprise you to know that I've, for a long time, have been hoping that the Commonwealth Games would be hosted in Melbourne. I think, the City of Melbourne would have delivered a much bigger, better games at a better price. But look, the City of Melbourne, we were just as devastated as Geelong, Ballarat, and Bendigo today.
I'll take that as a yes.
About the cancellation of the games. I think it's devastating. It's embarrassing for Victoria. It's a terribly sad day. I think it's also terribly sad for the Commonwealth Games as well. I think this is probably the final death blow for the Commonwealth Games. It's also the case, if I'm being really upfront with you, I do think it was probably the right call. Like on those numbers, at $6 billion, that is not an effective use of the taxpayers' money of Victoria, and that money can be put to much, much better good for the people of Victoria, and that's what the government said it's going to do now. So I was pleased to see there's that $1 billion there for housing and affordable housing.
So why did they bid for it in the first place?
As well.
Nick, can I just ask a question?
There's no getting around it. It's still a bad day for Victoria.
Why did they put their hand up for something that they knew would cost billions of dollars? Nick?
Well, these are the explanations we're going to have to get in coming days, Paul. Like, they went in with a budget of $2.4 billion, $2.6 billion. Now it's $6 billion. So we need to understand how the price got so high.
Imagine the compensation.
That information is going to be coming out.
Before we're done.
Oh, look, I just want to say, the only thing that I'm really sad about is that Chris Minns in New South Wales has not stepped up to the plate and said, we can do this. But I guess he didn't want to embarrass his Labor mate, Dan, who's not really the hope of the side for the ALP.
Well, maybe the federal government steps up and it's the Norfolk Island Commonwealth Games. But also, what about this cute little idea here? A few emailers have said, well, by 2026, won't we be a republic by then? So therefore, we wouldn't be in the Commonwealth for the Commonwealth Games.
Oh, yeah.
We're on Media Watch now with that speculation.
Well, yeah, and I mean, maybe that's why Minns didn't want to have to cop a visit from the King, because he wouldn't might have to light at the Opera House. Icky.
Oh, not acceptable at all. All right. So, Nicholas, again, we know that it's not going to be happening in Melbourne. We know that regional Victoria gets screwed over here. Do you believe that this was only there to get him over the line in seats that they were maybe worried would do a Kennett on him?
Oh, I think that's a very cynical view of things, Paul. I think the government had a good idea around trying to run a regional games. As it came to pass, it was something that it was just too costly, and they've made, I think, a tough but correct decision to not proceed with it. I mean, I do think it is interesting to see this development between these sort of multi-sport events like the Commonwealth Games and, dare I say it, the Olympic Games as well, versus these single sport events. So the FIFA Women's World Cup, I think, is going to be hugely, hugely successful. I think the Rugby World Cup will be hugely successful as well. And so there does seem to be something going on in global sport. And I do wonder about these sort of multi-sport events and what their future is. And it is a worrying thing, I think, potentially for the Brisbane Olympic Games.
Well, I'll tell you what the future is. The Olympics should only be in one city and kept there, and every 4 years everyone goes to that city.
Hear, hear.
Commonwealth Games, it should be the same. Then you get permanent upgrades to facilities rather than starting from scratch, and that would be a better bidding process for the permanent hosting of these things than basically sort of shopping through the list. And no disrespect, that I would be a Queenslander if I could have the blood transfusions, but eventually how you go from, literally, Paris, Paris, LA, Brisbane. Not exactly the same role of world cities that are applying.